Okay, so when we're doing research, there are basically three purposes. You want to look at the anatomy and the orientation and positioning. So anatomy is where the bones go on a two-dimensional plane. So one example of this is I like looking at x-rays, and when I have a pile of bones that basically look like this, I'll look at something on a two-dimensional plane and lay it out on the table, and I can figure out the order that the bones go in. The second thing we're looking for when we do research is orientation, which is basically how the bones are oriented in reference to each other. So this is on a three-dimensional plane. So now we're looking for something like this. In this image, I can see how these two bones would lay with this bone in the joint. And so again, when we make skeletons, we want them to be both scientifically accurate, but we also want them to look realistic. So a lot of times the research is looking at how those bones are oriented in reference to each other in a three-dimensional plane. And the final thing that you're looking for when you do research is you're looking for information for the final positioning. So when you're doing the final positioning, you pretty much have all the scientific stuff done. You know how the bones should move. And now you're just looking to make it look artful and make it look very realistic and cool. So for final positioning, I will often look at pictures of the live specimen. You can see in this page that I looked at a lot of pictures of alligators from the top and side view, and I was looking at how the wrist bones and the elbow bones are oriented in different positions. And so that would be an example of final positioning. Okay, so these are just some photos to illustrate anatomy versus orientation versus positioning. This is a picture I took when I was still in the anatomy phase, so I'm trying to figure out where these bones go on a two-dimensional plane. And again, I was looking at x-rays for this, although if you can't find x-rays, you can look at another thing. This is an early example of orientation. So how the bones in the appendicular skeleton are oriented in reference to each other. So this is when I start moving into three dimensions once I've got it all diagrammed out. And then this is an example of looking at final positioning. This is when I'm basically putting all the parts together, and now I'm really looking at the angles and how I want the skeleton to be positioned so that it looks like an alligator. So this is final positioning. So when we do research, the most important information that you'll find is usually images. Sometimes you can find relevant information in text, but a lot of times, since this is a very visual project, you're looking for images to base your skeleton off of. So the first thing that I like to do is I like to look for x-rays. You often are going to have a bit of a hard time finding them, but you can go through Google Scholar or Google Images and look for x-rays, or sometimes tomography or MRIs, and find information like that. This is really useful for anatomy, just in those beginning stages when you're trying to figure out what order the phalanges go in, stuff like that. Look at x-rays. The second thing you're looking for is scientific diagrams. So if you go through Google Scholar and use keywords, which we can go over later, a lot of times if you comb through the articles, you'll find diagrams or images that are just really useful in figuring out the orientation of the bones. So for example, this image right here, I think was in an article about the biomechanics of walking. for alligators, and this was really useful when I was positioning these bones. So that's an example of a scientific diagram. This is another example. For most specimens, you actually are not going to be this lucky. Luckily, there's a lot of research out there about the biomechanics of alligators because they're really interesting. So I found really detailed diagrams of the appendicular skeleton and other parts of the physiology, but with most specimens you will be able to find at least a few images like this. And again, these are just scientific diagrams. I got them from combing through probably 40 articles about alligators. Another thing you can look for is you can look for pictures from informal web sources. A lot of times websites will have information such as like veterinary websites, or sometimes other articulators will post information, enthusiasts, stuff like that. So that can be really useful, especially if you have a specimen that not a lot of research is being done on it, so you don't have a lot of resources from scientific diagrams. You just have to be careful, especially if it's something like this, that it is scientifically accurate, and you want to make sure that the source you're looking at is reputable. It's either like veterinary or maybe for a college class, something like that. So you can see with these ones, what I was doing is when I had to put the teeth into the skull, I was trying to count how many teeth were in a certain portion of the skull so I could put them in accurately, and for that, these sources were good for that. Another thing you can look for is pictures of other articulated skeletons. Sometimes this can be really useful for getting a big picture of the entire skeleton, especially when you're just getting started and you want to diagram what your end goal is going to be. It's good to kind of see the completed project and especially brainstorm, but you have to be really cautious with looking at skeletons that other people have done as references, because a lot of times you'll find people who just do this as a hobby, and they will either articulate it incorrectly or it's not going to be positioned quite right, and I can show you examples of bad articulation. So it is something to just kind of look at. I really like gathering these pictures, especially if I can cross-reference them with something that I found in a scientific article, because then you basically have multiple images or multiple angles of the same thing, which is really useful when you're working in 3 dimensions. But again, look for these, but be a bit cautious and make sure you know what your sources and probably how reputable they are. Another thing that's really useful, especially if you're having trouble finding research, is if you find any photos of incomplete maceration. This is nice because even if you get the photos from a source that might not be super reputable, like for example someone who just collects bones or a hobbyist, if it's incompletely macerated, a lot of times the ligaments and flesh is still holding the bones together, so you can still see how those bones would be articulated in the live skeleton. So that I had a hard time figuring out these clavicle bones right here, or sorry, the pectoral girdle bones right here, so these images were really useful. And finally, for positioning, it's really useful to have pictures of live specimens. A lot of times articulated skeletons won't look really realistic, or sometimes they'll even be scientifically inaccurate because the bones are positioned in a way that a live animal would never move. So to get the skeleton to look good, and especially to get the bones in the right position, I look at a lot of pictures of live specimens. This page is all pictures of wrist bones for the alligator. I actually have like 10 more pictures or 10 more pages just like this. Making notes on the length of the phalanges, how they curve, how they look in different positions. And then this is more pictures of live alligators to kind of look at the big picture, like when an alligator is in a certain position, what is it doing with its legs, like how is its tail moving, how high is its head being held up. So the pictures of live animals are really, really important for final positioning. Okay, so here are some tips for research. Some of these, if there's a lot of information out there, is to try to narrow it down to what will only be useful. But for most skeletons, you're not going to find information very readily. So this is mostly to help find information. So the first research tip is, for a new species, start with a Wikipedia page or a general article, maybe for students, and find relevant key terms from it. So you're just looking for general information like, what is the family? Are there any species that are really similar that I could look at to reference? You want to look for anatomy terms. You want to kind of get a feel of what kind of studies are happening for that species. So whether people are interested in locomotion or in certain genetic variants, stuff like that. So those are the kind of key terms you're looking for. You're looking for something that ties in with either anatomy or physiology. Biomechanics and kinetics are usually really good to go for. Osteology is also really good. Once you have kind of an idea, a list of keywords that you see pop up and that are related to the skeleton, put those keywords with either the species name or the scientific name into Google Scholar and Google Images. In Google Scholar, you're going to have to pull up articles that are relevant and just kind of look through them or look through the appendix and see if you can find images. A lot of times I'll also scan them to find more key terms, another lead to go off of. But make sure to do the same thing, put the same search into Google Images, because Google Images will oftentimes pull from the databases that Google Scholar uses, and it's just kind of a quicker way to do it. Usually using both of those, you can find some good stuff. If you find an article that looks like it has a bunch of the keywords, it looked really promising, but that you don't have the images you need, go through the references, because a lot of times there will be like 10 to 15 really similar articles that you can take, 20 seconds to scan through. And then the final thing is, this is kind of a last resort. This is mostly for looking at skeletons that other people have articulated, but sometimes it helps to look at skeletons at sites like Bone Clones, Paxton Gate, the Bone Room, Skulls Unlimited. Even with a Google search, you can just look for a site that sells skeletons. I've found stuff on taxidermy.net and Etsy and even Pinterest. But again, you don't want this to be the bulk of your research, but it is helpful to just kind of get more information. Okay. So some good places to start when you're looking for terms to search is always start with the species name and figure out using general sources if there are other names that the same species goes by. Find out the scientific name and then look and see if there's a species that's really, really similar, because if you're having trouble finding information, you can use that species as a reference, as long as you note that it's not the same species. So different names for the species. It's so far been really useful to look for terms such as biomechanics, kinetic, motion, position, rotation, biophysics, locomotion, and physiology. Those terms are really useful for going through Google Scholar. Also useful for Google Scholar is walking and trotting. A lot of times that will get you information for final positioning or for looking at the orientation of the appendicular skeleton. To look for examples of other skeletons, or sometimes just kind of general sources, especially general anatomy sources, you can look at anatomy, skeleton, joint, bone, morphology, articulation, osteology, and appendicular skeleton. Make sure you also kind of make a list of the names of bones, joints, or muscles in the area that you're looking to research and put those in as well. Then you can also look at Google Images and Google Scholar for tomography, X-ray, 3D, MRI, imaging, and sonomicrometry. And then this has been kind of a long shot, but it has worked a few times. Look for morphological traits, epigenetic variants, and discrete traits. So you'll use lots of different sizes of rods and wires. Here's an example of a really thick rod that I used for the skull in the alligator and to support the whole dolphin. This one is hard to work with, and you have to use a hacksaw to cut it into smaller pieces, but if you're trying to support a lot of weight, this is really sturdy. You could just get this at Home Depot. We have other sizes. Here's one that's also really thick. It supports a lot. It's hard to bend. And it's a little more malleable, so if you're working with something kind of like the body of the alligator that needs a lot of support but isn't like super heavy, and especially if you can have it sitting on rods, this is a good one. Just keep in mind that it is hard to bend and straighten these rods, although I think our lab will be acquiring a tool that'll make that a lot more easy. So there's this size, and again, this isn't like set in stone. You could just go to Home Depot and visually look at the size rod you need and then just drill that size hole. Or you could even try talking to the Home Depot workers. They might look at you like they're crazy or you're crazy, but they'll probably be able to help you. Here's something, again, like the smaller you go, the less support you're gonna get, but the more malleable it is. I use this size for the tail on the alligator because it's really light. This I use a lot for bones such as like the humerus or the tibia. I use this one on the alligator a lot. It is very malleable, which is nice. It's not going to provide support on its own, but if you couple that with like a 2-part epoxy or super glue, it does really well. We'll go over this more later, but if you just drill 2 holes in and put these in, then you still have enough support that the skeleton is going to hold itself in its articulated position. But you can also rotate the bones a little bit so you can do some final positioning with this. This is a paper clip. This is some 24 gauge wire. The paper clip I would recommend for bigger bones in like the appendages, especially like phalanges, if they're kind of bigger and if they're pretty sturdy. The really small ones, I would recommend using this wire, which is still really sturdy. It will hold shape, but it's really thin, and you're probably not going to break the tiny bones with it. This is a lot more sturdy, so you'll get a lot more support. It's harder to bend, but it's still really small. So I actually use paper clips a lot. This is the smallest wire that I use. You usually just get this at a craft store or Home Depot, and I can show you an example downstairs where I use this on the alligator and the dolphin, but I usually use this if there's something that I just have to cinch wire around. Usually if the bones are too thin to put a rod in between, but they're too heavy to be supported by just glue, and I really want to minimize the appearance of wire, I'll make two really tiny holes on the adjacent bones, and I'll just put this through it and cinch it really tight and then cut it, and you can pretty much not even see it. And then pretty much for the skulls, for something of probably a skull of mild weight, you can use a rod like this. For the skulls, I wouldn't use any rod with any type of give. And again, it's up to you what size you want depending on the weight of the skull. But just make sure whatever size you use, make sure it's not malleable, and that you drill the hole in the skull for exactly the same size so it's not going to move around. So these are some tools for working with wire. A lot of the wire, we have this really old wire cutter we can use, and then lots of different types of pliers. These are really useful for putting the wire into the glue and then into the bone, or like I was just talking about, if you have that really tiny wire, then you just need to twist it and then tuck it so it's not visible. These ones are really useful for that. And then also, I've used this on the skull before. I think I used this on the dolphin skull. A clamp set was really useful for attaching the skull to the end of the rod and getting it to hold its own weight. So again, for this, if you find yourself in a position where you have a really heavy skull or something like that and you need support, I would really recommend just going down to Home Depot, and you can take pictures and just explain what you need, and they'll probably give you something similar to this. Okay, here are some adhesives that we use. Usually for final setting, I will use a 2-part clear epoxy. However, I've noticed that on the alligator it's actually started to yellow, so we might transition to a super glue, which we'll see how well that works. When you use the 2-part epoxy, you squeeze both of these, make sure you get 50% of each of these, and just go ahead and put it in this weighing tin. Mix it together, and then you want to put it on as soon as possible, and then put pressure on it until it's dried. It does take a while to dry. It takes a lot longer than super glue, but the one of the advantages of this is, for example, when I was putting the chevron bones on the alligator, I would wait till the 2-part epoxy was a little bit hardened until it was kind of viscous, and then I'd put it on, and it was sticky enough at that point that the chevron bones would just kind of stick on, and that was a good adhesive. Wood glue is probably my favorite adhesive because it works really well at holding the bones together, but it's also, you can also remove it with hot water, so you can if you're like in either your orientation or final positioning stages and you need the bones to fit together but you're probably going to change them up, this is probably, like I said, my favorite adhesive because you can just put it on, it'll stick, it'll hold, and then if you need to reposition it, all you have to do is take some hot water. I usually just use a dropper and a bottle. Make sure the water is hot, and then you can scrape it off with one of these sculpting tools. Make sure you do get all the residue off because you don't want it to build up, because that's not going to look good, and sometimes with the smaller bones it can kind of warp the appearance of the bone. And the third type of adhesive that I usually use is a 2-part epoxy clay. This was used for the dolphin and for the feet of the alligator, and what you do with this is you take 50% of each in your hand and you basically mix it together. It will turn into something that's kind of like a putty or a clay, and then you can use these sculpting tools to make it look good. Make sure, because it's pretty hard to get off, make sure that you only have it exactly where you want it. I would use sculpting tools and hot water and even paper towels to make sure none of it is on the bones because it is gray. I can show you, it's like a dark gray, so you don't want that on your bones. That does take a while to set, so make sure whatever you're working on is supported really well, because if you leave this overnight to harden, and I think it takes about 24 hours to harden, probably it will move, and then you have bones hardened in the wrong position and you have to fix it. And then once you use the 2-part epoxy clay, if I use it in a place that there's not supposed to be bones, so if I'm using it to simulate space in between bones or like vertebral discs or something like that, I don't paint it because I don't want people to confuse it with the bone. But there have been times where I've had to mold completely new bones because we were either missing them in the maceration process, or I had to repair a bone, something like that. You want to paint it so it looks like bone. It's important to keep in mind that the 2-part epoxy is going to be like a dark gray, like a dark green gray-ish color. So I like to mix this with yellow food dye, and once I have my mixture, I take a piece of 2-part epoxy clay, just let it dry, and I usually paint it over 2 or 3 times until I get the right mixture, because skeletons will be different colors. Some will be more white, some will be more yellow. And then once you've experimented a bit, then put it on your skeleton, but you don't want to have something that's either too yellow or too white. So here's the Dremel that we use for dry articulation, and here are all the bits we have. Here you can see we have a lot of really small bits. Usually if we use bigger ones, we rent both the drill and the bits from the stock room, but they get really small as 1.05 millimeters all the way up to 2. We also have some diamond burrs that I'll use to help form bones if I have to create a new bone out of like a 2-part clay epoxy, or if I have to remove, sometimes like just the 2-part epoxy builds up. Usually if I have to remove something, I'll use these diamond burrs. And then this is an extra chuck, and here are shanks. We have a few different sizes. Here's a really tiny size for the 1 millimeter bits. We have some bigger sizes for the 2 millimeter bits. Then we have a tool that'll help us get the chuck off. So there's already a diamond burr in here. We're gonna replace it with a different one. So make sure it's unplugged and pick it up and press this button right here. Then you can use either this tool or a pair of pliers to loosen up the chuck. Yes, thank you. A pair of pliers to loosen up the chuck. Then you should be able to take the burr out. You can take the shank out too if you need a different size. And then you put the burr into the shank, stick it in here, and you can tighten it up with the chuck. So go ahead and rotate that, and to tighten it, press down on this button and make sure it's good and tight. Then you can plug it in and press on. Off, and make sure to unplug it. Here's some miscellaneous tools that we have. This is really useful when you start getting to the mount, when you need to kind of plan out the entire skeleton, or if you're trying to figure out if it'll fit somewhere. This I use a lot. Obviously it's just a ruler, but we've got it. The fishing wire, there are a few places on the alligator and the dolphin I can show you that I didn't, those bones in the skeleton are like kind of free floating. They're not really articulated to any other bones, and I wanted to preserve the natural appearance of the skeleton, so I use this to provide a little bit of support, but make sure that you don't see like wires. This hacksaw is useful for a lot of stuff. I use it for cutting styrofoam when I have to pin things, and I cut wire rods with it. So I don't really have a hard and fast rule for how to do the planning for a skeleton. I like to start with the digits, and especially like the wrist joints, because those usually take the most time, and it's probably the hardest to figure out anatomy and orientation on both of those. I really like putting all the bones in drawers and labeling each one with tape. So for example, let me show you a different box. With these, I would probably put these in a drawer and come up with a system that I'd write down. So like I would probably say left back, left front, so I'd abbreviate that to like LB, LR, and then I'd come up with a system of numbers for which digit and what order it is from the wrist. And you don't have to do that, but it's good to be organized, because especially with these little bones, you're gonna waste a lot of time if you have to basically reinvent the wheel every time you sit down to work with them. So I like to do that. If you use tape, make sure you don't leave it on for too long, because sometimes it does leave a sticky residue. The only other thing I can say about planning is, like I said, I like to draw out the entire thing first. I like to have just kind of a general picture of how I want it positioned. Then I start with the feet. Then I tend to like to do the spine, and then I do the positioning and the orientation of the legs and feet, because yeah, those are the parts that are going to be changing the most. So that's my advice. You might find with different skeletons you do different things, but that's how I like to do it. Okay, so I've already taken a look at the research that Mackenzie has done, and so this is going to be one part of the jaw. This will be the other part of the jaw. These two pieces right now are separate, so in order to articulate the top and bottom half of the jaw together, it's going to be easiest if I articulate these two to each other right now. I'm going to do it using a pretty thin, pretty malleable wire and some wood glue so that I can adjust the angle a little bit if I want it more closed or a tiny bit more open. So this is actually a really straightforward thing to articulate because it's just two pieces and they line up in a straight line. But for the sake of training purposes, I'll show you what I do sometimes if it is a more complicated angle. So you can't do this for too long because sometimes the tape leaves a bit of residue. But what I like to do is I cut a straight line of tape of some color. And I articulate it where I want it for now. We might change it a little bit to adjust it later. And then I put one side perpendicular to where I'm going to articulate it, like that. Just in a nice straight line. And then in a straight line on the opposite side, I'll put the other piece of tape so that if I have to come back to this, it will be really easy to line it up. And if I'm going to be articulating it in multiple places, it's hard to do on camera. If I'm going to be articulating it in multiple places, I can color code it and just see really quickly, like I can put it down, pick it back up. I see exactly where I want to put the wire. Okay, so to drill the holes for these, I'm going to start at the points that I marked up, and I'll go directly underneath it, and I'm just going to measure where the bone is nice and thick, so it's a sturdy place to drill a hole. It doesn't matter how far down you want to go. The only reason I'm measuring it like this is so when I make the same mark on the opposite, so that was red tape 1/8 of an inch down. Here I'm going to use red tape, go 1/8 of an inch down. The only reason I'm doing that is so when I make the same mark on the opposite one, they'll line up perfectly. Just like that. So I've already marked up where I want to drill the holes. When you're picking where to drill the hole, you want to find areas, if you can, where the bone articulates directly, so you can see here and here how the bones touch each other, and here the bones touch each other. The other thing you want to look for is areas of thickness of the bone, somewhere where it's strong, because you are going to be drilling a hole into it. So this right here is a good amount of space to drill a very small hole, and that right there is also a pretty good amount of space if I want to drill a hole in at a bit of an angle. Okay, so here are all the marks that I've made. I'm going to point out that these two articulate directly, while these two, there's going to be a wire going between them because there's a bit of a space there. So I'm going to drill here first and put some glue in it and then drill these ones. Okay, so I want to make sure for these holes that I drill them at about the same angle. That's not a necessity, but it does help a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill it where the bone is thickest. I'm going to drill it pretty much in a straight line from here to here. And then I will show you what we do next. So I'm just going to apply really gentle pressure at first to kind of clear out like a bit of a groove where I can safely start drilling, because you see this is really close to my fingers. And then I'm just going to apply a little bit of pressure and do it nice and slow. If my drill is slipping, then I need to find a groove to push it in so I get a firmer grip so I don't hurt myself. Okay, so it's not drilling really well and it's smoking, so I'm going to get a smaller drill bit and see if I can concentrate a little better pressure on it. Okay, we're trying a bit of a smaller drill bit. I've got that groove in there, so I should be able to apply a good amount of pressure, and I'll just push it really carefully. Okay, so you can see I was able to drill a nice neat hole here. This right here, sometimes you get this around the jaw, you get a really thick bone that's hard to drill through. That's what this is, and this is why we drill holes where you can't really see them from the way you'll be viewing the skeleton, because it's not really drilling, it'll just burn. So I've got enough of it. I've got maybe a millimeter, which I can work with. And yeah, that's just why we like to drill holes, especially if they're in any bones near the jaw on the inside where you're not gonna see it. I also want to show you guys another method I use, since I do have to apply a little more pressure than I expected to these parrotfish bones. Sometimes I like to do for really small bones, if I have to apply a lot of pressure, is I'll take some clay and put wax paper over it, and then I will press down the bone, and I'm gonna press it down so I can drill just straight down the way I want to. It's kind of like a clamp, but it's really good for regular shaped bones or small bones. Although, as you can see, like, I could tip it this way, so you still have to hold it out here, but it just provides a lot more stability. And now I can apply as much pressure as I need to, keep my fingers safe, and drill a straight hole because it's supported on almost all sides. Okay, so for these holes I opted for a wire that's about medium size in terms of width, but it is very malleable. And I'm going to cut it really long and set it in the first set of holes. So this one on both sides, the best I could do with the thickness of the bone was to get about maybe a millimeter in. So I'm gonna use wood glue. Wood glue is great because it will set pretty quickly. It has a pretty good hold, and it can be removed with water. So if we need to adjust this angle, which we might end up doing, it'll be really easy, because all we have to do is put warm water on it and we should be good to go. And again, I'm putting these in and making sure they're a lot longer than we need, because we're going to cut them down to the length that works. So go ahead and stick this one in. I'm trying to get some glue near the ends in the middle of the bone, so I'll sometimes go up and down a few times until you can't really see the hole anymore. It means there's glue in there. With this one, I'm going to, for now, kind of leave a lot of the glue on the outside because the hole is so shallow. But for this one, I want to get rid of that glue because it's going to dry to be a dark orangish brown color. So what I like to do is pretty simple. Just roll up a paper towel, fold it so you get a sharp edge, and then I'll use a dropper and some water. And just gently wipe away at it to clear up that opening so that it looks good. And you just want to get rid of, using the water, any of the sticky residue, because that's going to dry a different color as well, and it will definitely look bad. There we go. And like I said, I'll leave this one just to give it a little extra support for now. Okay, so I was able to cut this wire down right here so that it lines up perfectly with this one right here. But these holes, the red ones, are just too wide, and they don't have enough depth to really use wire with them. We can use a 2-part epoxy. I generally don't like doing that to begin with because I like being able to adjust the angles a little bit at the end. And I'll show you, if you do need to remove 2-part epoxy, I'll show you how to do it. I just don't really like doing it. It's a lot of work. So I was going to show you guys how to repair something. These holes, you're not going to see them, which is why we picked this location to drill. But I'll show you how to repair bones on these holes if you ever do need to patch up a hole. What I'll probably end up doing is, you can see right there that there's a very tiny bit of bone. I'm going to drill a really small hole kind of near the edge on both of these bones, take a really thin wire and then twist it and articulate it that way. But I'll show you how to patch up the bones. So we're using the 2-part epoxy clays. You take a 50-50 ratio of each. It's okay to estimate it, so this is my estimation of 50-50. Right now our clay is very old, so it might take a minute to mix it. You don't have to wear gloves. I just wear gloves for this step because I'm allergic to something in the clay. But you just want to mix it up really well. This epoxy takes about 24 hours to set. It's really good for patching up holes. If you use it for something like the way I used it in the dolphin, you'll want to have everything set up perfectly because this will lose its shape over the 24 hours a little bit. So if it's supporting any weight, it will droop or morph. We're gonna take some of our sculpting tools and I'm also gonna loosen it up just a tiny bit with water. You don't want to use too much, but just loosen it a little so it's easier to work with. Yeah, see, that's a lot better. These are the sculpting tools we have assorted. It really doesn't matter which one you use as long as it works. So I'll use this one to get it in there, and then a tool that's a little better for scraping to clear it out. So I'm just pushing it in. Since this hole is so shallow, It's really not going to take much at all to patch it up, but I'm just going to make sure it's all pushed in. And then I'll take another one like this. I like to dip it in water so it sticks to the epoxy a little bit less. And just very carefully scrape it away. Like that. So you can see I'm not leaving any residue on the outside of the hole. That's because it is gray. So it will both mess with the shape of the bone, and it will just look bad because it's gray. This doesn't matter too much because this is going to be somewhere you can't see it. I'll do the same thing with the other side of the bone, and then I'll go through and just put a bit of paint on it. Okay, so what I've done is I've drilled 2 holes right in that little small area that I was telling you about, right there and right there. So I'll get to that at the very end. That's just kind of for structural support. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead, this wood glue has set really well, so I'm just going to go ahead and put the other end in the wood glue as well. And let it set. I already cut the wire, made sure that it would fit correctly. So now I'm just going to go in with a paper towel and clean up this edge a little bit, and then I'll tie the wire right here just for stability at the very end when I've worked out the exact angle that I want it at, in case I want to move it about 1 millimeter. Alright, so we're just going to thread it through. It needs a little extra support, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to put the wire in now, but I'm just going to do it really gently so we can keep the adjusting angles, but get a little more support. Okay, so I pulled it through. I'm going to loop it so these 2 pieces will stay together, but again, I am not going to do it really hard. First, because the holes that I drilled, they're in a part of the bone that does not have a lot of space, so could break the bone. So I'm just gonna, it's gonna be messy at first. I'm just gonna grab the wires and twist them in one direction, and I'm just gonna keep doing that till it starts getting a little neater. Okay, so we found that in order for this to articulate correctly right here, we needed to increase the width of this bottom part of the jaw. Sometimes when bones dry, the ligaments will tighten and the angles will become smaller, so it was kind of closer to here a few minutes ago. So in order to loosen up the ligaments, We put it in hot water, and I usually leave it for about 5 minutes and then really gently try to loosen the joint a little bit and just kind of stretch out those ligaments. Once we were able to stretch it out so that the bottom part of the job was the width that we need, I set it on this clay, so this is going to hold it in place. The nice thing about ligaments is they basically serve as their own method of articulation, so we shouldn't need any wire or glue or anything. It'll just dry in this position and stay in this position. So I used some clay to hold it in the right spot, and we're just going to go ahead and let it dry, and then tomorrow we'll come back to this. This for now has the one wire right here, some glue right here, and we're going to go ahead and let it dry and work on it tomorrow. Okay, so we've looked at some pictures of parrotfish, and we've marked up how we want these to line up. Both sides are labeled. We make sure they matched up, and I'm gonna drill a hole right here, right in the center of that orange tape and in the thickest part. And I'm just gonna drill a hole perpendicular to like the middle line of this lower jaw. So I'm just going straight in about right here. It's nice and thick. And I really do think that this articulation needs a little bit of support. So I am going to try to drill a hole right there to articulate in. It'll probably only go in about 1 millimeter, and then I'm going to use a 2-part epoxy and a paper clip to add extra support. But I'm going to drill the holes and make sure it fits first before I actually start gluing stuff in. Okay, so I drilled a hole. I just picked a point, drilled the hole. Now, in order to know where exactly to drill the hole on the top part of the jaw, I'm going to take a bit of mechanical pencil lead, stick it in, and then I break it off just about maybe 1/2 millimeter or 1 millimeter above where it's supposed to be. It's a little hard when it's so thin, but alright, that'll work. So now I've got it sticking out just a tiny bit. I line up the pieces of tape, so it's already set in the position that I want it to be in. I just want to know where to drill the hole. So I line these up so that they're straight, and I go ahead and press it down. I don't know if you can see that, but that made a mark. I don't think you can see it. Made a mark right there. So that's where I'm going to drill my hole. Okay, so I drilled both holes. This is the second hole. And just to make sure that it was going to fit, I used wood glue because I might end up changing this. And I put it in the hole that's just a little bit deeper because that's going to provide more support and keep it steadier. I did leave, normally I like to wipe off all the glue, but on holes that are really shallow, I like to actually leave a mound of the adhesive as long as it's going to be inside the point where the two bones articulate, which it is, because it provides just a little extra support. So now that I've done that, I'm going to line these two holes up just to make sure that they're in the correct place. they are. I can line them up. I'm gonna look at the other bone, and it looks good. I might make the wire a little longer, but it's in the right place. So okay, so I've drilled all the holes and I've put in some wire with wood glue. This is stiff wire, and now I'm gonna leave it for 24 hours, let it set, and then I'll trim the wire down and see if I can slide the top on. Okay, so here I have two parts of a bone that I broke off. A lot of times when you're articulating skeletons, you'll find that bones either come to you broken, or maybe you nudge them and they break. A lot of times it's pretty much almost guaranteed that you're going to have to change the angle on a bone at least once, which sometimes means drilling a new hole. So I'm gonna show you two types of repairs right now, and we can talk about undoing some other mistakes later. The good thing is, even if you break something completely in half like this, it's actually pretty simple to fix. So the first thing I'm gonna do is patch up this hole right here. I made this hole pretty tiny, so it might take a second to get the clay in, but using the 2-part epoxy clay and some water and a sculpting tool, thank you. Go ahead and get as much of the clay in the hole that you made as possible. It's a little hard to do with gloves that are a little too big for me. You don't need gloves to do this. I'm just wearing them because I'm allergic to the epoxy. But if you're not allergic, you don't need gloves. So I'm just using this tool right now. Any tool will do, but I like this one, to try to put as much epoxy in it as I can. I'm wetting the tool so that the epoxy is going to stick to the bone and not my tool. So you don't need to get it really far in. I'm going to take another sculpting tool. It doesn't really matter, but I like this shape. Again, dipping it in water so it comes off really easily, and I'm just gonna really carefully scrape the excess off. And I'm gonna leave the surface really clean because this stuff is gray, and bones are usually like a kind of off-white color. So, I don't even know if you can see it. Well, you'll just have to trust me. That right there is where I patched up the hole. Right now, it looks pretty much the exact same as the rest of the bone. You can't see it protruding at all because I scraped it carefully along the surface. You don't see a hole at all because it's filled up now. If this was in a place where it's really prominent, and it's not because it's on the inside of the ribs, I would take a little bit of paint and mix it up so it's the exact color, and then test it really carefully on the 2-part epoxy. Make sure before you use paint on actual bone that you go ahead and mix some epoxy and let it dry for 24 hours and harden, and then paint it with the different colors you want and wait another 24 hours because the gray undertones will shine through. So a lot of times I find that the paint color that I end up using this as a test is actually like pretty orange and yellow. So that is one way to repair a bone. So another way to repair a bone, there are actually two ways to repair a break like this. This is luckily a nice clean break, so you can see once I carefully slide it in and push it together, you can't even see where the break was. Actually there's a tiny nick right there, so if I was doing this for real, I would go ahead and fill that in just like we filled up the other hole, but this is just a demonstration. So if I didn't think these ribs would be supporting a lot of weight, these are pretty small ribs. So if I were doing this for real, I would probably just use 2-part epoxy, the adhesive, not the clay. But just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use wire to give it a little more stability, and I would use wire. So for example, I used it in the dolphin because those ribs were really long and they supported themselves. So it needed a little extra support to not cave in like that. I would use them for a skeleton that's kind of heavy, so if these bones were a lot bigger or thicker, I would do that. Or just if I think that the skeleton might be moved around a little bit, I would put the rod through that too. So it's pretty straightforward. Luckily, in line with each other, it's almost a straight line, so I don't even really have to do much measuring. I'm just gonna go ahead and take the Dremel and drill a hole. I'm making the hole pretty small since this is a pretty small bone. Okay, so I've drilled the hole in this. I like, for breaks like this, or just something where you're never gonna need to move the angle of this bone to this bone, so I like using really stiff wire. So I'm gonna go grab that real quick. Before I do that though, I like taking a tiny piece of mechanical pencil lead and sticking it in the opening, and then I'll break it off so it just barely protrudes from the surface. And then, so I know where exactly to make the second hole, I go ahead and fit these two bones together. As well as I can, and it's not going to be perfect because there's a piece of lead in there, but hopefully after doing this there will be a small mark. I don't know if you can see that. No, I don't think you can, but there's a really small mark exactly where I should make the drill, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've drilled both of my holes. I went ahead, I like using a paper clip sometimes if I need a small but really stiff wire. So I cut off a piece of a paper clip and I'm gonna slide it on. I cut it a little bit longer than I need, so you can see it's about, I don't know, 3/4 of a millimeter too long. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim it down. You don't have to trim it down exactly. It's okay if it's a little shorter than you want. But I'm just gonna make sure this fits. And it does. If you can see, there are no breaks in that, and it aligns straight. So now what I'm gonna do, a lot of times I recommend, you know, with joints or especially like digits, use something that's malleable and use wood glue so you can move it in the final positioning stage. This rib is always going to be in the same direction because it's all one bone, so I'm just going to go straight to 2-part epoxy, and I'm going to mix it up right now. Okay, so I cut off a bit of wire. I actually like using toothpicks better because I think they're cheaper, but we're out. So I'm squeezing this so that 50% of each comes out. I need a new one. Yeah, we need a new one. Okay, so to put these two bones together, it doesn't really matter how you do this, but I like to just start with the wire, put a little bit of glue on it, which, by the way, it's not supposed to look like this. This is just really old. It's supposed to be more of a clear consistency. So I put it in. I'm gonna use a tool to apply it to the other side of the wire. You want enough because the porous part of the bone will absorb the epoxy, but you don't want too much because it does tend to stain the outside of the bone. So I'm gonna go ahead and slide it on. I'm gonna just slide it around a little bit to try to get as much as the epoxy down into the hole that I drilled as possible. And then I'm going to push it together and set it. Once it's set, you can see there's a little bit of epoxy on the outside. I'm gonna try to remove that as quickly as possible because it will stain. Thank you. So I'll just remove the extraneous stuff, and I'm trying to remove it along the break so it's not, thank you, so it's not smeared all over up and down the bone. I'm gonna go ahead and set it again. Most epoxies that we use require about 24 hours to set, but usually it will stay in place if you just hold it and put pressure on it for about 5 minutes. And with this epoxy, it's, like I said, not supposed to look like this, but you want to mix it thoroughly and then put it on as fast as you can, because when it's more of a watery consistency, it will hold better. So yesterday I put a little of this epoxy on the bone so I can show you how to remove it. You can use this if for some reason you move to the epoxy and you're going to need to re-glue it or adjust it a little bit. You can use it to pry apart the two bones, or you can use it if it's something like this and there's just a protrusion from the epoxy. So you should really do everything you can to avoid this because it's not good for any bit you're going to use, and it takes a lot of time. But I've found that the best way to remove the epoxy, if you absolutely have to, is you move along the surface of the bone with a diamond burr and just take it off piece by piece. It's gonna get really hot. It's also gonna probably melt, and you just have to take it off really slowly. Make sure to, if you take your fingernail, mine are short right now, but a tool to scrape it off and get it right where it starts, you can kind of chip it off once it dries. So it just takes a long time. It's not good for your bits, but if you absolutely have to, this is the best way to do it. So I'll just kind of show you right now. So you can see I've removed a lot of it. There's a little bit right there still and a little bit right there, so I'll keep whittling that down. But that's the best way to remove the epoxy. Okay, so one tool that I want to talk about is vinegar. I've used this a few times, sometimes during the drying process or maybe the degreasing process. Some of the bones will warp and they won't articulate correctly. This happens with really thin bones. So I figured out that you can use a dilution of vinegar and water to loosen up the bones just enough so that it's pliable enough for you to put it up against the bone it's supposed to be articulating to. And I'll show you an example of this on the alligator downstairs. And then use a clamp so it stays in place, and when it dries overnight it will dry and harden in the shape that you clamped it in. So it's a really, really useful tool. You shouldn't find yourself using it too much, but like I said, if you have a flat bone that's supposed to sit basically parallel to another bone and it's not because it's warped, this is a really, really great tool. Every skeleton is different, especially depending on the size and the density of the bone that you're using. It will change the concentration of vinegar that you use, and it will change how long you leave it in. So for that, I would suggest just setting up a good old-fashioned experiment. Experiment with a few different concentrations. I think the last few times I tried it with 15%, 30%, 50%, and 70%, something like that. It doesn't matter too much. And then with each of those percents, the second variable was how long I left it in for, so like 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, etc. You'll want to source some bones that are about the same size and density to practice on, but that shouldn't be too hard. And just go and mark it down. You want, before you decide what you're going to do with the actual bone that you want to keep, make sure that you clamp it in place, because at certain concentrations the vinegar will wear the bone down so much that it will break when you clamp it, or it's not going to dry correctly. So yeah, I would look at, as response variables, look at how crumbly it is, how malleable it is, if you can put it in the same position, and then if it will break or if it will dry in the correct position. So yeah, like I said, this is a really useful tool that you shouldn't end up needing very often. I don't think I see any bones on the goat that would need vinegar. It's possible, but unlikely that you'd need it on this one. But when you do need it, it's very useful. Okay, so every once in a while you might find yourself in a situation where you are missing a bone. This has happened to me a few times, and if that happens, it's okay. There are a few ways that you can make a new bone for the skeleton. So it's important to decide whether you're going to take the same bone on the opposite foot, if it's one of the digits, or if you're going to take a bone that's about the same size but is not symmetrical. So I'm going to pretend that I'm missing the left side of the same bone. So the replica that I'm going to make is going to be the mirror image of this. So there are a few ways you can make a new bone. The first is to use the 2-part clay epoxy to make a general shape, and then use the diamond burrs to whittle it down. And then once you have it down to about the right shape, you can paint it. Another way, this is a way that I haven't used, but you can use it. If you need to make basically an exact replica of the bone, so for instance, you know that there's going to be a bone right next to this bone anatomically that's about the same size and shape, you can make a cast or a mold and then make a new one out of 2-part epoxy clay. And then the third option, which is something that I've looked at before and it's definitely feasible, you just have to talk to the right person, is you can have someone at the library scan it into a 3D imaging software, and they can then 3D print either the same image or its mirror. But you have to just go talk to the right person. Alright, so I've took 2 equal parts of both parts of the clay epoxy and mixed them together. They're kind of hard, so sometimes if I'm not using this as an adhesive, I'll mix in a little bit of water so it's malleable enough. So this takes about 24 hours to set and dry. It hardens by itself, so what I'm doing right now is I'm going to get it to the approximate size and shape, but just a tiny bit bigger than the bone I'm trying to replicate. So I've done this before, using a ruler or some parchment paper to write on. Since this is a pretty straightforward replication, I'm just going to set them side by side. Like I said, it's better to be a tiny bit bigger because you'll be whittling it down. So to make sure it's about the same width, I'm going to set this on top. It fits. So I'm just going to lay it side by side, and I'll smooth this out in a second. Just using water and maybe some paper towels, and then I'm going to wait 24 hours for it to set. Okay, so you can see here that I've made a really rough replica of this bone. This is going to dry for 24 hours, and then I'll take the diamond burr and sculpt it a little more that way, but for right now what I'm looking for is just to get the general shape. So I'll kind of show you how I did this. In order to create a mirror image, and this is not quite the shape I used, but in order to get a mirror image, I made a pretty big rod of clay for this one, so I had lots to cut down on. And then I flipped the real bone over like that and overlaid it. And again, this is a lot thinner than I actually used, but just to demonstrate what I did. Flipped it over. You can go ahead and press it in a little bit just to hold it in place. And then I take a scalpel and I dip it in water. That just helps it cut through the clay really easily. It just helps in general. And then I put it face down so it's perpendicular to the table, and I'm just making little marks about 1 millimeter from where the edge of the bone is, so I get a really rough picture of the shape of the bone. So I'm going to pretend, just for the sake of time, that I went all the way around. Pull the real bone out. You can see, like I said, this is a pretty rough picture, but it does give you something to work with. So then I'll dip my scalpel in the water again, just making it easier to cut through the clay. And I'm going to go out a little bit outside the lines that I've made and just cut off the extraneous stuff. Once you've done that on all sides, that's where you flip it over. So this is a really rough copy of this bone. However, you want all sides to look right, so I'll flip this over, flipped this over. It's kind of rough to get the bottom part because the clay still is malleable, so I just laid this on its back for about maybe 20 minutes and it's already flattened out. So if you can, maybe when it's dried a little more, you can basically do the same thing. Either drawing an invisible mirror on your mind, and just doing it by sight, or you can flip it over this way. If I wanted to make a bone that isn't the mirror image, that's basically the same, it's pretty straightforward. All I would do is the same thing. But this time, instead of flipping the bone onto its back to get the mirror image, I just overlay it straight on and make the marks, cut it out. And it doesn't have to be super clean. You don't want it to have less clay than the actual bone does. You're just trying to get the general shape. So you can see this is a lot more square than the actual bone, but there are places where I've just taken a little bit away. That's okay, because tomorrow I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna get it a little bit better. But just looking at it, there are some places where I rounded it out with my fingers or with the sculpting tool. Some places where I took the scalpel at an angle, like right there, just got rid of it a little bit. And I will let it dry, let it sit on its back, and then do it again. Okay, so I've let the 2-part clay epoxy dry for about 24 hours. It's now rock solid. And it's in like the general shape, but a little bit bigger so I can whittle it down. So in order to sculpt it, you use the Dremel, and we have a few different types of diamond burrs. You can see lots of different shapes. I would just suggest studying the shape of whatever angle you're trying to make and then picking one of these. It doesn't really matter, but I'll give you a quick demonstration on how it works. Okay, so I'm looking for a diamond burr, and I'm just going to give you one really easy example. You're just going to have to study them pretty closely. You can overlay one on top of the other, although since they're symmetrical, you'd have to put the original bone upside down. That does help. You can see it overlays really well. I'm just going to do the simplest thing right now and work on the back. This hardened overnight, so whatever curve there used to be is gone now. So I'm just gonna put them side by side, and I'm just gonna do this by eye. Draw a line that looks about the same. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be passable. Okay, so now I've got my marks. I'm just gonna go ahead and mark this up for myself as well. Just letting myself know where to stop and start. Now I'm gonna go through, I'm gonna take the piece I chose and just whittle away. Be a little careful because the epoxy does get really hot, so don't burn your fingers. And I'll go through, even that out, and just keep going. I'll do the same on the other side. The really big burrs are better for evening it out. In the interest of time, I'm not gonna do this really well right now. But I would go through and do the same on the other side and just do that across the whole bones until it looks pretty much the same as the original. And then you paint it. So this is a dolphin. This is the first skeleton that I ever did. And I just want to show you a few pointers. So this skeleton is unusual because it's suspended from the ceiling. I had to build it on a PVC pipe frame. And now it's installed in the ceiling. It's got a few things. I don't know if you can see right there the use of fishing wire. Here again you can see I used 2-part epoxy clay to be true to the actual anatomy of the digits. The other thing that I did is I used the 2-part epoxy clay in between all of these vertebrae. I think that made sense for the dolphin. It didn't make as much sense for the alligator. It made sense for the dolphin because they have really thick discs between every vertebrae, and this makes it actually a lot closer to the length that it's supposed to be. I think this is a good skeleton to look at patterns on. So even if you have no idea how the vertebrae are supposed to go, you can see that there's actually a progression between bones. It goes in a line, and if you study these bones really closely, you can see pretty much how it's supposed to curve. Here you can see there's a protrusion from the bone that goes down in a steady line, and you can see that the shape of the bone changes, stuff like that. The rib cage, a few of these ribs were repaired using the methods that I showed you. It was pretty difficult to do this rib cage because the ribs are thin enough that you can't use super thick wires to support them. However, they're long enough that they're really heavy, so it was hard to get these ones to stay in line. So what I did for this is, you want it to look like round, like everything is in line, it looks like a cage. But when I was setting each bone individually, I used a piece of wire to go across the rib cage. I think kind of like that, a little neater, but it did that, and then I used wire cutters to remove it. The skull, again, skulls are generally pretty heavy. This skull is also supported pretty much on its own, and it's connected to the spine using some bolts. So that's another example. So this is just one other example to look at. This is kind of an example of what we're trying not to do. We try not to have the really big, thick rods. They're kind of distracting and they just don't look too great. You can also see that when the wire is on the outside, it's not a very good system for keeping the bones in place. You can see a lot of them are actually misplaced. But 2, it just looks a little messy. And it's not necessarily that this was articulated poorly. It's just that, like, when you have the wires on the outside, no matter how neatly you do it, it's gonna look messier. Positioning on this one kind of makes or breaks it. You can see what I was talking about, how important it is to have the appendicular skeleton looking good. I think half the reason that this skeleton doesn't look awesome is because of these feet, which don't really look like that, and that. So even if the bones weren't falling apart, a horse doesn't stand like that. and you can really tell, and it makes it look a little different. However, this cow is definitely a better example. Here we still have the thick wires, and we still have some wires on the outside. It's hard to do ribs that big, but there were a few ways to do it. I would have used thicker rods there and articulated them directly. It looks like they didn't use any adhesives. And I would try to drill a hole at least 1.5 inches into those ribs because they're huge, so they could take that. But this is, at least it looks a little better from a distance because of the way this appendicular skeleton is placed. It's a little more accurate, and then I think this is a really good example of an appendicular skeleton. Animals tend to walk like this, and even though we'd like to use a little less rods, I actually like this skeleton a lot. I think it looks pretty good because it's got a lot of the rods on the inside, and because it is positioned pretty well. That's a really good appendicular skeleton. So for designing the mount, use a big piece of parchment paper. You might have to tape a few big pieces together, and measure the dimensions of the skeleton, and then decide if you want a symmetrical mount or an asymmetrical mount. So an example of a symmetrical mount is this one here for the giant trevally. An example of asymmetrical is the one for the alligator. But I would strongly recommend waiting until the skeleton is completed before drawing the mount. Because the few times that I've tried to draw the mount first and then fit it in there, it just didn't turn out really well, and I ended up redrawing it anyway. So I would suggest doing the skeleton, taking all the measurements. I like to measure like how wide it is every 6 inches, so I can kind of plot it out and then draw a shape from that.